If you could tell our viewers, what is the significance of this move?
Well, in reality, it doesn't have any real significance because the United States has already imposed maximum pressure sanctions. Those limited sanctions that existed in the UN Security Council resolutions, those are all already uh, falling within the scope of U.S. sanctions as we speak. So it doesn't really make much of a difference. There is a psychological impact, but Iranian society will soon get over it. So nothing new will be added. And in addition to that, the Russians and the Chinese have already indicated that they will not accept the legitimacy of the snapback because, um, in accordance with the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015, there is a dispute mechanism. And these three countries have not used that dispute mechanism. In addition to that, these three countries have violated the nuclear deal ever since the United States. I mean, they violated it from day one under Obama, but the Europeans, along with the Americans. But when Trump exited the deal and tore up the deal and imposed maximum pressure sanctions again, um, the Europeans did the same. And so the Europeans were violating all of their commitments. Whereas the Iranians, after the Americans and the Europeans began to violate every single one of their commitments, the Iranians continued to abide by their commitments for a full year. And then after a year, the Iranians, in 5 stages, gradually decreased their commitments. So effectively, it took 2 years for the Iranians to ignore its obligations within the JCPOA, but that is something which is allowed because within the nuclear deal, it says that if one side does not abide by its commitments, the other side can discontinue abiding by its own commitments. But what Iran did was it didn't even do that. It waited for 2 years before getting there. So the West owes Iran. Iran doesn't owe the West anything. And the International Atomic Energy Agency's statements from those years after Trump exited the deal are clear that Iran continued to abide by its commitments, whereas the Europeans didn't. So the Europeans violated the deal. They are in no position to uh, use this mechanism. And in violation of the deal, they did not use the dispute mechanism. And that's why the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese are saying that they do not have the legal authority to use it. But what the snapback is basically is that it says that if one of the members of the JCPOA they uh, um, they complain about violations, if they go through this dispute mechanism and so on, um, then the sanctions will be those sanctions that were in the UN Security Council resolutions will be reinstated. But again, as I said, they refrained from using the dispute mechanism, which makes this illegitimate. And they were the ones who violated the nuclear deal, not the Iranians. But I would also like to add, just for the sake of your viewers, some may say, well, why did the UN Security Council impose these sanctions in the first place? Well, first of all, it shouldn't have. But the Russians and the Chinese back then, well over a decade ago, they were much weaker than they were today. That was the era of US when the US was the hyperpower and Russia was recovering and China was growing. So when the United States brought forward resolutions to sanction Iran, the Russians and the Chinese would water them down, but they wouldn't veto them. So we do have these sanctions, but again, as I said, in accordance with after the nuclear deal, those resolutions were set aside. But now the Europeans want to revive those sanctions, but as I said, legally they cannot, according to the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese.
I wanted to ask you for some clarity on this legality thing because I'm not sure how this works. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that Iranians are trying to use talk with Russia and China to prevent the reinstation of the snapback. As I tried to read it, what I understood in terms of the legality is that if one party under the JCPOA, if one party moves a resolution, if one party triggers these mechanisms, then there would be a 30-day period under which a resolution can be passed to seek relief, which can be then vetoed by any single party. If that understanding is right, then legally speaking, Russia and China cannot veto the E3 from reinstating the sanctions. Is my reading right about the legality? I understand that Russia and China would not abide by the sanctions, implying that they would continue to participate in defense collaboration, in nuclear collaboration, etc., etc. But that's the second discussion I would like to have about it. But in terms of the pure legality of it, is my understanding correct?
First of all, in my opinion, this was one of the major flaws of the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And Iran should not have allowed the West to have this snapback capability. If I was negotiating, I would have said, I either you do not have this right or I walk away. But that's me. Back then, I was not in favor of this, and I think that this was a shortcoming of the Iranian government that they allowed this to be put into the nuclear deal. But that aside, yes, there are two different interpretations. Any one of the members of the JCPOA, meaning the British, the French, the Germans, the Americans can't because they've left. The Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, for whatever reason, hypothetically, they could do this. However, so if they use this mechanism and there's no resolution after 30 days, then automatically then the UN resolutions are revived. Automatically. There's no vote. If one of these states uses this mechanism and there's no solution during that period of time, then automatically they're revived. However, what the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese are saying is that A, the West violated the nuclear deal, not Iran. And they do not have any legitimate right to use this mechanism, the snapback mechanism. But more importantly, in my opinion, they say that technically they did not go through the mechanism for resolving disputes, and therefore they're violating the deal as well. So in any case, what we're going to have is a revival of those UN resolutions in the eyes of the West, and in the eyes of the Iranians, the Russians, and Chinese, they're not revived. But of course, since the bureaucracy in the UN and so on is controlled by the West, they're still going to be using it and trying, but it's not going to have an impact on Iran. And the reason is that, as I said, it will have a psychological effect for a while, but there's nothing in these sanctions that hasn't already been imposed on Iran. Iran is facing maximum pressure sanctions. And that basically means maximum pressure. It means that you cannot go any further. So these sanctions that will be reinstated, they are limited in scope. They're about they're military and nuclear, but they're limited in scope. Iran's military is for the most part self-sufficient. Its industry, Iran's nuclear industry, is self-sufficient, as we all know, and therefore it won't have a huge impact. And if the Chinese and the Russians don't accept the legitimacy of those resolutions, then they, of course, will ignore it, and that will be an incentive for other countries to ignore it as well.
What you are saying is very important. You are saying that the US sanctions are, in economic terms, much more comprehensive. They are on aviation, they are on oil, they are on
Everything,
metals, everything, including banking,
everything
payment
you can
system.
imagine. importing medicine is sanctioned. Why? Because airlines are sanctioned, the shipping industry is sanctioned, the banking system is sanctioned, everything is sanctioned. So Iran basically, over the last 10 years, had to develop a completely, its own system where it conducts its trade. Uh, so some countries won't trade with Iran, some do. It is increasingly being ignored, the sanctions. And I think a lot of that has to do with Dr. Raisi, because when he was president, he said, I'm not going to wait for a nuclear deal or for it to be revived. I'm going to export my oil. And so the Iranian government, for example, began exporting more oil. They gave big discounts, and then gradually the exports rose, and gradually the discounts lessened. And by the time when he passed away, Iran was Iran was producing crude oil at maximum capacity, and it was selling its oil almost at the international rate by that time. So uh, Iran is now used to uh, these sanctions. It doesn't mean that Iran wants sanctions and it doesn't matter. No, it impedes, it causes difficulty, it causes corruption, because when the state and the private sector, when everyone has to go underground, then of course that creates corruption. So the state doesn't want this. But in any case, it is able to function. And we see that the Iranian economy grows. And we see that the Israelis and the Americans, with Western support, waged war against Iran, and they lost the war. So Iran, under sanctions, obviously, over the last few decades, has been impressive in many respects. I'm not saying that there are no shortcomings, there are many shortcomings. But I think it's quite impressive how Iran has been able to manage over all these years.
So, first of all, on the issue of sanctions and whether they would have an economic impact, the sanctions of the UN per se did not even have much of an impact the first time around. It's the fact that the sanctions at the UN Security Council, Chapter 7, legitimizes individual countries to impose their own unilateral sanctions or align their own unilateral sanctions with the level that the US set. This is what happened in 2010. After the sanctions were passed at the UN, the Obama administration went on a massive global campaign to get as many countries as possible to impose their own sanctions, using the UN sanctions as the legal justification and the basis for it. Now, will the Trump administration be able to do the same thing? Will it have the credibility? Will it have the bandwidth? Will it prioritize that? That remains to be seen. Secondly, it's also true, given the fact that so many of these countries already, even though they don't have unilateral sanctions, are nevertheless withholding from trading with Iran because of the American sanctions. The added pressure may not be particularly significant. That's true. But I think it's at the same time important to recognize that if UN sanctions are on the books, it makes it much more difficult for any country who wants to restart trade with Iran to do so. So it will create another layer of political resistance towards actually opening Iran up for greater trade without challenging the multilateral system. And we have seen that we are now moving towards a world in which the countries that are actually insisting on international law, insisting on the centrality of the UN, insisting on international norms, etc., that are established, are actually coming from the global south rather than from the West. In the past, it was Western countries that constantly justified their decisions based on international law. I'm not saying that there wasn't a lot of hypocrisy or double standards, but it was very much at the center of how they were operating and organizing their policies. After Gaza, I think we have seen a significant shift. I mean, ICC decision to issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant have by and large been disregarded by the Europeans. even if the Germans have not actually allowed Netanyahu to visit, the fact that the chancellor have said that he is open to considering inviting Netanyahu to Germany means in and of itself that it is hollowing out of the ICC. And I mean, I grew up in Europe. I remember when the Rome Statute was signed, it was seen as a civilizational leap forward in Europe. It was seen as a massive achievement towards creating a world that was much more based on law rather than force. And now it is the European themselves who are undermining it. So in that context, and by the way, take a look at the first point in the SCO statement document that came out. It was very much centered on the centrality of the UN and international law. So in that context, how will China and Russia deal with an arms embargo or a snapback sanction? What we've seen so far is that they call it illegitimate and they're challenging it on a legal basis, saying that the Europeans are in no position to be able to exercise it because they themselves had left de facto the JCPOA. They were just like the US, they were no longer part of the JCPOA because of not living up to its obligations, but also by endorsing zero enrichment and even endorsing Israel's attack on Iran. That essentially, in their legal argument, puts them outside of the JCPOA. Whether that argument holds or not, I don't think is the question. The question is that this will be a disputed snapback. But it nevertheless means that the Russians and the Chinese are going to be careful about how far they go in violating it, even though they don't believe it to be legitimate, because at the same time, they do not want to add, particularly not from the Chinese side, a further weakening of the UN system. And it's not to say that China doesn't violate things at times, etc. It's the fact that China has chosen to really center its foreign policy on the UN system, whereas the United States for quite some time, including very much under the Biden administration, was increasingly walking away from a law-centered order and moving towards this so-called rules-based order, which is based on the rules that the US set up rather than international law, which is a much more participatory and objective process for establishing law.